I love my wife above all else. I have loved her since the moment I first laid eyes on her. I would do anything for her, and that has never changed after all these years. We first met in college. We were both theater majors, and it was day one of Acting One class that our eyes met for the first time. She had chocolate brown eyes that were complemented by her dark brown curls. We stared at each other constantly that first day, and when we were partnered together, we knew that it was fate. "My name is Margaret," she said as soon as I walked up to her after class. I took her by and hand and kissed it. "Henry," I responded. She then took one of my long dreadlocks and wrapped it around her finger, staring me in the eyes and biting her lip. It was an amazing meeting with an even better ending later that night. The following night, we went on our first date, a theater production of Sueño. We held each other's hand through the entire performance, and afterward, I walked her to her dormitory. Every day after that was like a love story. We went through good times and bad times. We broke up and got back together. Through it all, one thing never changed for me. I loved her and would do anything for her. We got married after graduation and went on to become very successful in the stage acting scene. We were considered a power couple and were always cast in romantic roles opposite each other. It was easy to bring the true deep love that we felt for each other to the stage, and it was nice to make money from it. One day, our lives took a turn. We had just finished a successful performance of the stage play The Clean House when we were approached by a member of the audience. "That was an amazing performance," he said, a creepy English accent behind his words. "Why, thank you. You're sweet," said Margaret, gripping my hand. I could tell this guy had creeped her out, but being a talented actress, she was able to put on a nice front. "I've been watching you two for a very long time," he continued, his pale blue eyes staring into Margaret. "I am very much a fan of your work. Every performance is riveting, and I can tell that you put true passion into your exchanges. You two must truly love each other." "We do," I said, stepping slightly in front of Margaret. "We love each other very much. I would do anything for her." I looked at her, and she gave me that beautiful smile of hers. "That warms my heart to hear," he said, as he put his arms behind his back and looked up into the night sky. "True love is a valuable gift that is often taken for granted. If you're not careful, you can easily lose it forever, and it can never be replaced, no matter how hard you try." He then looked at me, and I could see just how disturbing his pale blue eyes were. "Hold on to that gift. Cherish it forever." He began to walk away before I asked the question that had been bothering me since we met. "Who are you?" I yelled. He stopped and turned his head. "Your biggest fan," he answered. He then walked away. Margaret and I looked at each other, baffled at what had just taken place. Later that night, we were sitting on our couch watching a movie when suddenly there was a knock at the door. "Wonder who that could be," said Margaret as she got up to see who it was. She looked at the peephole and froze in place before taking a single step back and opening the door. Standing just outside the door was the same man we had talked to earlier that night. He stood there with his arms behind him, his pale blue eyes shining like the moon. "Honey," I said, standing up from the couch to join Margaret at the door. "Please, come in," Margaret said to the man to my shock. "What are you doing?" I yelled, running to get to the door. The man stepped inside before I got there and began to stroke her face. When I finally got to them, I threw my fist and connected with his face, knocking him back outside. I quickly slammed the door and locked it. I turned to Margaret, who was in some sort of a trance. I tried to snap her out of it. "Margaret!" I yelled, shaking her. "Margaret, wake up!" There was nothing I could do to get her to respond. I shook her, slapped her, and even splashed water in her face. Nothing would work. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out. I looked around until I saw the silhouette of a man standing outside our living room window. I blinked, and it was gone. I began to panic and ran to the gun safe in our bedroom. Despite being theater nerds, we were very well trained in self-defense and firearms. We could each hold our own if our lives were in danger, and if there was ever a time to put that training to use, it was now. When I got back to the living room, I immediately raised my weapon. There stood the strange man holding Margaret by the face. "Let go of her, motherfucker!" I yelled, aiming for his head. He looked at me, and the only thing I could see in the darkness was glowing red eyes. He then turned his head to Margaret, and I fired, hitting him directly in the head. He fell to the floor hard, and I ran over. Margaret fell over too, but I caught her before she hit the ground. She still would not respond, her eyes wide open in a trance. I looked over to the man, but he was gone. I gently laid her on the floor and stood up quickly, readying my weapon once again. Suddenly, I felt a strong, tight grip on the back of my neck, and I was then thrown across the room, hitting the wall. I groaned in pain as I grabbed my gun and slowly stood to my feet, shaking as I raised my weapon again. Again, he had a hold of Margaret, but this time he pulled her head close to his. I felt my heart race and my blood boil as he put her lips to his glowing red eyes staring right at me. "No!" I screamed as I ran towards them. He then pushed her to the side and opened his arms to me, as if inviting me to fire on him again. I obliged and fired 5 rounds into him, but all he did was allow them to connect as he laughed. I ran up to him, but he grabbed me by the throat before I could do anything. He pulled me close to his face, and I could see every horrifying feature. Not only did he have demon-like eyes, but his face was covered in disgusting, pulsating veins. In his mouth were 2 sharp fangs and a long, slimy tongue, which rubbed against my face as if tasting me before taking his first bite. I lifted my gun to the arm that had a hold of me and fired twice. He growled in pain as he released me, and I connected the butt of my gun to his face repeatedly. He fell to the floor, and I mounted him, smashing his face more and more harder and faster. I could feel the blood gush and spray all over as the bones in his skull crack and collapse. By the time I was done, there was nothing but smashed bone, brains, and blood. I panted as I stood back up and limped over to Margaret, who was now fully unconscious. I shook her, and she finally opened her eyes, looking into mine with fear and confusion. "Margaret," I said, feeling relieved that she was all right. I held her close, and we laid there until I looked over to where the body of the stranger should have been. He was gone, and panic arose once again, and we both stood up quickly. I turned to face Margaret and screamed when I saw him standing behind her, still in the process of regenerating his face. Before I had a chance to react, he sunk his fangs deep into Margaret's neck. She screamed in pain as I screamed in rage, hitting the monster in the skull once again with my gun. I felt bone crack again as he released her. Again, I mounted him and went to work, growing exhausted the longer it went. I knew this wouldn't last, as he would surely regenerate again. It soon became obvious what exactly I was dealing with. He had put Margaret into a trance merely by looking at her, even looking through a peephole. It wasn't until he invited him inside that he actually got in. He had glowing red eyes and fangs, and he bit Margaret in the neck. He's a goddamn vampire, asterisk, I thought to myself. While he was down, I ran to the kitchen and grabbed an old wooden broom. I broke it in half and ran back to the body, where I rammed it as hard as I could directly into his heart. The body began to convulse and flail its arms and legs all over. Suddenly, it stopped and went completely limp before melting away into deep red blood and other disgusting fluids. After catching my breath, I slowly turned my attention to Margaret. She sat there in the darkness, legs folded and upper torso full erect. "Honey," I said, nervously approaching her. In the darkness, I could only see her silhouette until her eyes began to slowly glow red. There was only one thing I could think of to do. I love my wife. I would do anything for her, even if that meant chaining her up in the basement, feeding her a pint of my own blood every day while I figure out what to do about her. When the hunger would hit her, she became like a wild animal that cannot be communicated with. So I fed her my blood, and she became herself again. She understood the situation and never held it against me. It wasn't easy, but it was all we could do. Unfortunately, a pint only went so far until soon it wasn't enough. So I gave more and more until the point that I was endangering myself with so much blood loss. It was then that I decided to feed her full meals. It started with small animals at first, and then cats and dogs. Soon, I made the hard decision to invite homeless people into our home, knock them out, and give them to her. This went on for far too long before it really started to affect us. She felt like a monster, and I did as well. It was then that I decided to feed her full meals. It started with small animals at first, and then cats and dogs. Soon I made the hard decision to invite homeless people into our home, knock them out, and give them to her. This went on for far too long before it really started to affect us. She felt like a monster, and I did as well. I love my wife, and I would do anything for her, which brings me to now. I'm sitting here writing this, shaking. There is literal blood on my hands as I try to compose myself. She asked me to do one last thing for her. I refused at first because I loved her too much. "If you love me," she began, looking me deep in my eyes, her now pale blues not blinking, "you will do this." Tears fell from both of our eyes as I pulled her in close. "I love you, Margaret," I whispered. "I love you, Henry," she responded. I could hear the squish as I drove the wooden stake in her heart. I trembled as I listened to her whimpers, gasps, and eventual silence. I broke down as her body melted away into liquid. I laid there in her remains, sobbing. I sit here now with nothing left but the warning about the creatures of fiction that are very much a reality. I write my confession of the crimes I have committed out of love. I say goodbye to any friends or loved ones that may be reading this. I loved her, and I did everything for her. The Room with the Train. This story is not about a ghost or an encounter with a creepy stranger. It's not even about a near-death experience or something like that. As a matter of fact, I was never endangered during the event I'm about to tell you about. Nonetheless, it's a disturbing memory that I will carry with me until the day I die. I grew up in a small city, the kind of place you could barely call a town if it wasn't for the sheer number of people living there. Downtown was only a couple of blocks long, and in the middle of it was one of the biggest buildings in the area. It was the local movie theater, named after the city. I remember going there when I was very young, about 7 years old, and watching the first Pokemon movie. It was probably nothing compared to the theaters we have nowadays, but back then it was huge for me. I loved it. So when a few years later I heard the cinema was going out of business, I felt really sad about it. The building was sold to a religious group that used it for their services. You know the type. Loud music, big crowds with their arms in the air singing prayers, some having seizures on stage while the pastor yells through a mic. Every time I walked past the old cinema, I would see the announcements of the congregation where the movie posters would have been, and if they were in session, you could hear them singing from the other side of the street. This group owned a cinema for nearly a decade, until the local government bought back the building in order to restore it as a historic landmark of the city. When this happened, I was studying construction with the intent to follow architecture or civil engineering at college. And my class was very lucky to be involved with the cinema's restoration project because 2 of our teachers were architects working on it. I will always remember the day we went to visit the old cinema. Our class was small, only a handful of students, but we were all around the same age. So we all shared childhood memories of when the cinema was operational. We ran through the corridors of the auditorium, sat in the chairs, just like we did when we were little kids, and began stomping on the wooden floor with our feet, filling the entire room with the echoes of our drumming and our laughters, a little ritual of sorts everyone used to do right before the beginning of the movie. Once nostalgia time was over, we went back to the purpose of the trip and began to survey the building. We were very excited because that was a unique opportunity to go into the places we would have never been allowed to otherwise. So we made sure to check every last corner, every single room, no matter how far, no matter how obscure. The first one we found was below the stage. On one of the corners, there was a little door, not very visible, probably because it was meant for maintenance staff only. Behind it, we found a long room filled with rusty boilers, part of the old heating system that was no longer in use. The place was a little creepy, with all of those old tanks and pipes crowding the narrow space. But what we found past them was what really started to freak us out. This room was small, very small. It was, after all, basically just leftover space behind the boilers. Yet it contrasted so much with the rest of the area around it, it may as well have been from a different place altogether. The walls were painted a light color, white I think, but I don't remember it very well, because what really got my attention were the drawings in them. There were rainbows, a smiling sun, trees and flowers, and happy little people with smiles on their faces of dotted eyes. It was a daycare. The whole class and teacher gathered to see the discovery. We were all very confused about the strange placing of this room. Okay, we could understand the need for a place to keep the kids that were too little to be amongst the crowd during prayers, or maybe the ones of the people who worked there, but the placing was just odd. The stage was probably one of the loudest places in the auditorium during the services, and this was right below it, so there was no way it could be a quiet place for the children. We left the boilers room and continued our tour through the theater, a little puzzled about our finding, but not giving it too much thought. Outside of the auditorium, there were the bathrooms, both in terrible condition, the ticket sale booth, and a huge set of stairs that led to a mezzanine in the auditorium. Half of the seats there were totally ruined due to a water leak in the roof, and I cursed these people for not taking proper care of the building. With that part done, all that was left was the projection room on the 3rd floor. Behind the tickets booth, there was a door that led to a spiral stair. I don't remember how tall it actually was, but it must have been over 10 meters of metallic steps without a single resting spot. I wasn't exactly an athlete, but I could walk several kilometers with no problem, and rode on a bike to and from school every single day. Yet by the time I reached the top of the stairs, I was exhausted, and I wasn't the only one. All of my classmates complained about how hard it was to walk up there. After a short break to catch our breath, we moved on to explore the third floor. It was roughly a narrow passageway with a couple of divisions to form different rooms, but it was more than enough for what it was made for. The first room from the stairs was a storage deposit, probably where they kept the movies and other equipment, and except for some trash, it was mostly empty. The second room was the one we were all excited to see, the projector room. The old machine was so big that it was still there, and there were even some pieces scattered around. It was quite a piece of history, and we were all very thrilled to check it out, so no one really bothered to move on to the very last room until we were about to leave. And there we saw it again. There was a train in this one instead of a rainbow. Something was written on it in big, colorful letters. Something about Christ. I can't remember it well. The drawings were a bit old, the paint slightly peeled from the walls, but the colors were just as cheerful as you would expect for a place where children play. My heart sank to my stomach as I came to the realization of what that place really was. The one behind the boilers probably serving the same purpose. I took notice of how isolated that room was, literally the furthest away you could possibly get from everyone else. I thought about the 3 floors of stairs and imagined what it would have been like to a child to walk all the way up, only to end up in that room, the room with the colorful train in the wall. My classmates and I exchanged horrified expressions, as I knew they were thinking the same. We never visited the theater again, even though we continued with the restoration project for several months, and we never talked about those 2 rooms. Cases of molestation in the church are well known by everyone, to the point that the pedo priest is practically a cliché, but this is the kind of thing you think happens in some place far away, in another city, even in another country. You never imagine it can happen in the very same town you live, the place where you grew up, in the very same building where you once watched a Pokemon movie when you were 7 years old. A hitchhiker's nightmare. To understand the magnitude of my story, you must know who I am. So, here's a little backstory. I was born in 1954, so my formidable years were spent growing up under the influence of the 60s and early 70s in a small town in upstate Ohio. When I say small, I mean one light at Broadway in Maine. There were about 40 businesses in the center of town. The drugstore soda shop was right on one of those corners. There was also the hardware store, small grocery store, Ben Franklin's gas station, and a barber shop. We had Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, and Catholic churches, and most everyone went to one of them weekly. You get the picture. It was Mayberry. We also had a library, a post office, and a jail. The jail was set up so you could easily sneak right past the cop desk 9 times out of 10 to go see if anyone was in jail. If there was, we would run errands for them, go get cigarettes, whatever. We never bothered to ask, "What are you in for, kids?" I was a curious, free-spirited, and completely wild and innocent child. A little bit later came the assassination of JFK, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam protests, and the hippie revolution, which I joined in becoming one of the earliest hippies. So, Maybe you can now guess where this story is leading. Hitchhiking was commonplace in those years, so I did it a lot. For a little over 3 years, I made many trips all over the U.S. and Canada, much to the dismay of my mother. Sometimes I took friends, sometimes I went alone, always with no money, no clothes, and no worries. So many people tried to warn me of the dangers, but being very young and naive and feeling quite invincible, I ignored all of their well-meaning advice. This wasn't my first trip, nor was it the last, but it is the most memorable, and you'll now understand the gravity of the very close call that it was. June 1969, I was 14. I was spending the night with my friend Dina, who lived in a neighboring mirrored town. I talked her into coming with me to San Francisco. She just happened to have a brother living out there that she had not seen in a while. So we headed out across the cow pasture to the highway and stuck out our thumbs. It never took long to get a ride, as you can probably imagine. We received many rides. A band tour bus picked us up on the way to a gig in Chicago, but we didn't want to make that big of a detour, so we passed. I can't remember who the band was. I remember another ride when we got into a convertible Cadillac with 4 black men and went to a party in Blacktown, Columbus, Ohio. We were the only white people at this party, and let me tell you, we had a blast. I never felt unwanted or in danger. In fact, the nice lady that lived in that apartment gave me a shirt, which I thought was so kind. Now, as an adult, I realized she was trying to cover me up. God bless her. The next ride was pretty cool until he picked up another hitchhike, a lone guy who kept nagging him about how much trouble he was going to be in if he got caught taking these 2 underage girls across state lines. I became very agitated and told him to shut up. We should have gotten out right then and there, but we stayed. He wasn't dangerous, just annoying. Well, the driver stopped for gas in Iowa, and Dina and I went into the restroom to freshen up. When we came out, the cops were waiting for us, and we ended up in the Iowa City Jail. I'm sure our parents were contacted immediately, although I do not recall this. We were quite the attraction in this little jail. The cops would come up and talk to us and play cards. They would bring us cigarettes, candy, and donuts. Another Mayberry. I don't think we were there for too long before Dina's mom had driven out to pick us up. And after a conversation with her daughter, she decided to drive us the rest of the way to California. That's just over 1,900 miles. Unbelievable. I remember singing to the radio all the way to Nevada. I especially remember the mamas and the papas. Are you going to San Francisco? Later, we booked into a hotel in Reno. Boring. This is not what I signed up for. I tried to talk Dina into just taking off. I realize now, as an adult, what a terrible, selfish act that would have been, and how devastating that would have been to her mom. Lucky for everyone, she refused to do that, so I stayed. We finally ended up in San Francisco, right at Haight and Ashbury near Berkeley College, where all the hippie action was, with her mom tagging along. It was all so overwhelming to me. I was pretty cool for our little town, but this stuff is way out of my league. I did mention how naive I was. I was not fully aware of things like drug addiction, but I was at firsthand at Needle Park. Seeing everyone strung out on drugs scared me to death. I saw other things too that I cannot mention. Needless to say, I was shocked. I wanted to go home, and I have never wanted to go back to California again, and have never been back even to this day. I don't remember how many weeks I was gone on that particular adventure, but shortly thereafter, I was home watching TV with my mom. It was July, and it was all over the news about the Manson family and the infamous murders. I then realized how close I had come to being picked up by them and possibly becoming one of the family. What if I would have taken off on my own looking for adventure and had not stayed with Dina and her mom that night? Hitchhiking alone through the desert 9 hours away from a spawn ranch? What if that guy had not turned us into the cops in Iowa and we would have been out there just the two of us? Most assuredly I or both of us would have gotten picked up by one of them. Later, I found out that the family were recruiting people from Haight or Ashbury, and also how irked I was because we couldn't lose her mom. Every day I'm thankful that I did not get caught up in that. I was sure ripe for the picking, especially if they would have gotten a hold of me before I made it all the way to California. In all my adventures, I was never beat up, raped, or murdered. I really do believe that I was under divine protection. I was 16, and me and my friends, I'll call Evan and Jake, wanted to rent a hotel for the night since it was spring break. We got to the hotel and checked in. It had a really funky smell, but we still stayed there. Once we got to our room, it was about 3 p.m., so we decided to go swimming. The pool was downstairs, departed from the hotel. Once we got to the entrance, there was a man at least 6'3" in all black, with a hood covering his face. Facing us, I panicked a little, but not out loud. We got into the pool and swam for a few hours until we saw that man again, all black, sitting on a chair by the pool. I cleared my throat. Can I help you, sir?" I asked. No response. I'm still a little paranoid. I put my face in the water, and at the bottom of the pool was another figure that was all black. I screamed like a little girl and ran for the door. I looked back and saw nothing, not the guy in the chair or the guy under the pool. My friends thought I was just seeing things, but I saw what I saw as clear as water. I didn't feel like swimming anymore, so I decided to get dinner at a nearby restaurant. I got a table for me and my friends to sit at, and there I saw once again the man all in black on the other side of the dining room, and was staring at me. I've had enough. I went over there, and I lost track of him, and he took off. After I decided this trip has gone too far, and we should leave tomorrow morning, but my friends didn't like that idea. Once it was 10:30, I and my friends dozed off in the hotel room. I woke up to some noises. I saw a shadow of a figure at the end of my bed. I calmed myself down and told myself that it was my hat that I put there before I went to bed. I went to bed and got woken up again 30 minutes later to more noises. I was getting thirsty, so I reached under the bed and tried to grab my water bottle, but I grabbed something and I was totally shocked by what I grabbed. It was my hat. I was never more scared in my life. I couldn't help but to scream at the top of my lungs when I heard a voice next to my ear say, "You're a bitch." I jumped out of bed and realized it was 2 men in black right there. I tried to fight them, but it was no use once they grabbed me and dragged me out of that room. I tried to scream, but that guy was covering my mouth. I passed out and woken up on a stretcher. It turned out those guys knifed me while I passed out, and someone caught them. But the doctor said no one could catch the guys who got me. To this day, I always have a nightlight at night, so I'm not scared. How he caught a ghost? "Yes, the house is a good one," said the agent. "It's in a good neighborhood, and you're getting it at almost nothing. But I think it right to tell you all about it. You are orphans, you say, and with a mother dependent on you? That makes it all the more necessary that you should know. The fact is, the house is said to be haunted." The agent could not help smiling as he said it, and he was relieved to see an answering smile on the two faces before him. "Ah, you don't believe in ghosts," he went on, "nor do I, for that matter, but somehow the reputation of the house keeps me from having a tenant long at a time. The place ought to rent for twice as much as it does." "If we succeed in driving out a ghost, you will not raise the rent?" asked the boy with a merry twinkle in his eyes. "Well, no, not this year at any rate," laughed the agent. And so the house was rented, and the slip of a girl and the tall lad, her brother, went their way. Within a week, the family had moved into the house, and were delighted with it. It was large and cool, with wide halls and fine stairways, and with more room than they needed. But that did not matter in the least, for they had always been cramped in small houses, suffering many discomforts, and they never could have afforded such a place as this if it had not been haunted. "Blessings on the ghost!" cried Margaret gaily as she ran about as merry as a child. "Who would be without a ghost in the house when it brings one like this?" "And it is so near your school," said the mother, "and I used to worry so over the long walk. And David can come home to lunch now, and you don't know what a pleasure that will be." "It seems to me," David gravely explained, "that if I should meet the ghost, I would treat him with the greatest politeness and encourage him to stay. We shall not miss the room he takes, shall we? I think it would be well to set aside that room over yours, Maggie, for his ghost ship's own, for we shall not need that, you know. Besides, the door doesn't shut, and he can go in and out without breaking the lock." And then they all laughed and had a great deal of fun over the ghost, which was a great joke to them. They were very tired that night, and slept soundly all night long. When they met the next morning, there was more laughter about the ghost, which was shy about meeting strangers, probably, and had made no effort to introduce himself. For the next 3 days they were all hard at work, trying to bring chaos into something like order. And then it was time for the school to open, and Margaret was to begin teaching. And David inserted an advertisement in the city papers for a maid of all work who might help their mother in their absence. For 1 whole day, prospective colored servants presented themselves and announced,
"Is this the house where they wants a work lady? No, ma'am, I ain't gwine to work in this house. Catch me working in no haunted house."
After which they each and all departed, and others came in their stead. One was secured after a while, but no sooner had she talked across the fence with a neighbor's servant than she, too, departed. "Never mind, children," said Mrs. Craig wearily. "I would much rather do the work than be troubled in this way." So the maid of all work was dismissed, and the Craig family locked the doors and went to their rooms, worn out with the day's anxieties. They had been in the house 4 days, and there had been neither sight nor sound of the ghost. The very mention of it was enough to start them all to laughing, for they were thoroughly practical people with a fondness for inquiring into anything that seemed mysterious to them, and for understanding it thoroughly before they let it go. David was soon sleeping the sound sleep of healthy boyhood, and all was silent in the house, when Margaret stole softly into his room and laid her hand on his arm. He was not easy to waken, and several minutes had passed before he sat up in bed with an articulate murmur of surprise. "Hush," said Margaret in a whisper, with her hand on his lips. I want you to come into my room and listen to a sound that I have been hearing for some time." "Doors creaking," suggested David as he began to dress. "Nothing of the kind," was all she said. They walked up the stairway and along the upper hall to the door of the unused room. Something was wrong with the lock, and the door would not stay fastened, as I have said. Something that was not fear thrilled their hearts as they pushed the door further ajar and stood where they could see every foot of the vacant floor. And one of their own boxes stood in the middle of the room, but aside from that, nothing was to be seen, and they looked at one another in silence. "Hold the lamp a minute, Maggie," David said at last, and then he went all over the room and looked more particularly at its emptiness, and even felt the walls. "Secret panels, you know," he said, with a smile, but it was a very puzzled smile indeed. "I can't see what it could have been," Margaret said as they went down the stairs. "No, I can't see either, but I'm going to see," said David. "That was a chain, and chains don't drag around by themselves, you know. A ghost could not drag a chain if he were to try. The conventional ghost very often drags chains," said Margaret as she closed the door of her room. And then she lay awake all night and listened for the conventional ghost that dragged a chain. But it seemed that the weight of the chain must have wearied him, for he was not heard again. The mother had slept through it all, and next morning they gave her a vivid account of the night's adventure. "Perhaps it was someone in the house," she said in alarm. There were no ghosts within the bounds of possibility, so far as she was concerned, but burglars were very possible indeed. Then Margaret and David both laughed more than ever. "What fun it would be," said David, "for a burglar to get into this house and try to find something worth carrying away." So they went on to the next night, all three fully determined to spend a night in listening for the ghost and running him to earth if possible. But it was Margaret that heard the ghost after all. She had been sleeping and was suddenly startled wide awake, and there overhead was the sound of the chain dragging. And just as she was on the point of springing out of bed to call her brother, the chain seemed to go out of the upper room. She lay still and listened, and in a moment she heard it again. It was coming down the stairs. There was no carpet on the stairs, and she could hear the chain drop from step to step until it had come the whole way down. There it was, almost at the door of her room, and something that was strangely like fear kept her lying still, listening in horrified silence. Then it went along the hall, dragging close to the door, and then further away and back and forth for a while, and then it began dragging back up the stairs again. Step by step she could hear it drawn over the edge of every step, and by the time it had reached the top, she remembered herself and called David. Again did the brother and sister make a tour of the upper room with the lamp. Not only that, but they looked into every nook and corner of the upper part of the house, and at last came back baffled. They had seen nothing extraordinary, and they hadn't heard a sound. "I'm going to see that ghost tonight," David said to his sister the next evening. "How?" "I'm going to sit up all night at the head of the stairs. Don't say anything about it to Mother. It might make her uneasy." So after the household were all quiet, David slipped into his place at the head of the stairs and sat down to his vigil. He had placed a screen at the head of the stairway so that it hid him from view, as if a ghost cared for a screen. and he established himself behind it and prepared to be as patient as he could. It seemed to him that hours so long had never been devised as those the town clocks told off that night. He bore it until midnight moderately well, because, he argued with himself, if there were any ghosts about, they would surely walk then, but they were not in a humor for walking, and still the hours rolled on without any developments. He took the fidgets and had nervous twitches all over him, and at last he could endure it no longer, and had leaned his head back against the wall and was going blissfully to sleep when he heard a chain dragging just beyond the open door of that unused room. In spite of himself, a shiver ran down his back. There was no mistaking it. It was a real chain, if he had ever heard one. More than that, it had left the room and was coming straight towards the stairs. The hall was dark, and it was impossible for him to see anything, although he strained his eyes in the direction of the sound. And even while he looked, it had passed behind the screen and was going down the stairs, dropping from step to step with a clank. Halfway down a narrow strip of moonlight from a stair window lay directly across the step. Whatever the thing was, it must pass through that patch of light, and David leaned forward and watched. Down it went from step to step, and presently it had slipped through the light and was down. And a little later it came back again, through the light, and up the stairs, and back into that unused room. And then David slapped his knees jubilantly and ran down to his room, and slept all the rest of the night. Next morning he was very mysterious about his discoveries of the night before. "Oh, yes, I saw the ghost," he said to Maggie. "There, don't ask so many questions. I'll tell you more about it tomorrow, maybe." And that was all the information she could get from him. It was very provoking. That day, David made a purchase downtown and brought home a bulky bundle, which he hid in his own room and would not let his sister even peep at. "I'm going to try to catch a ghost tonight," he said, "and you know how it is. If I brag too much beforehand, I shall be sure to fail." He was working with something in the hall after the others had retired, but he did not sit up this time. He went to bed, and Margaret listened at his door and found that he was soon asleep. But away in the night, they were all awakened by a squealing that brought them all into the hall in a great hurry. And there, at the head of the stairs, they found the huge rat trap that David had set a few hours before, and in the midst of the toils was a rat. "Why, David," exclaimed the mother, "I didn't know that there was a rat in the house." And then, all at once, she saw that there was a long chain hanging from a little iron collar around the creature's neck, and she and Margaret cried together. And this was the ghost. Such a funny ghost when they came to think of it, this poor rat, with a nest in some hole of the broken chimney. He had been someone's pet, once perhaps, and now the households he had broken up, the nights he had disturbed, the wild sensations he had created, it made his captors laugh to think that this innocent creature had been the cause of the whole trouble. "I'll get a cage for him and take care of him for the rest of his life," said David. "We owe him so much that we can't afford to be ungrateful." The next morning he took the ghost in a cage and showed it to the agent and gave him a vivid account of the capture. "So, you have a good house for about half price, all on account of that rat," exclaimed the agent grimly. "Young man, but never mind, you deserve it. What are you working for now, $6 a week?" If you ever want to change your place, suppose you come around here. I think you need a business that will give you a chance to grow." And the agent and David shook hands warmly over the cage of the ghost.